Now we're going to take a look at some vocabulary smart sheets and how middle school social studies teachers have used them when teaching vocabulary. A couple of things to keep in mind when it comes to vocabulary. First of all, when students are asked to basically look up a term and write the definition, very often that results in very little or no memory of the term. So generally just copying definitions is not going to work really well. In part is because the dictionary definitions typically are not worded in student-friendly language. Often those definitions contain terms that also need defining, and so trying to define a term using words that also need defining doesn't work really well. So what happens is students often have definitions they're copying, they're not really thinking about what the meaning of the term is, and sometimes they don't even really understand what the definition is saying. And then they try to memorize definitions that they really don't understand, and that dog just won't hunt. Okay, so some key things about definitions. First of all, they need to address the distinctive features of the term, what's really critical to understand about the term. And so one of the things we want to do is make sure that the definitions are in student-friendly language, which basically means don't define terms using other terms that also need defining. Key things that must happen if you really expect students to remember these terms beyond the immediate forthcoming test. Okay, they have to elaborate the terms. Now, elaboration can occur in a lot of ways, but the key thing is that student uses the term in their own words in multiple applied contexts, like a minimum 15 or 20 times. And so that's a lot of using the term in applied context. Another thing is that students have to connect the term to real experiences. So anytime you can design kinds of activities or experiences in your class that actually involves having the students use those terms that they're expected to know, then they're much more likely to remember the definitions. Another thing you can do is anytime you can get students to visualize or draw or illustrate what a term means, they're much more likely to remember it. And they also have to make personal knowledge connections. They have to think in terms of what this term reminds them of or makes them think of. So on the Make Sense toolkit, there's a section specifically devoted to teaching vocabulary. And so each of these subcategories under vocabulary are links to different types of vocabulary smart visuals, and we're just going to examine a few of these so you can get a sense of what's on here. I'm going to click on word castles, and we're going to just look at a simple one to begin with. So if you look at the prompts on this, you have the term, and then so what's the definition? And so what we're trying to get kids to do here is give me the gist of what this is about and then something specific about it, so just in details, as opposed to copying the dictionary definition. Then what we're going to have students do is actually illustrate what they think that term means. So sometimes students draw pictures, sometimes they'll go find a picture and import it into this. If they're importing pictures, we need to make sure that they are able to tell me why they picked that picture and how, in what ways it reflects the definition. And we also want them to think about what this term reminds them of or makes them think of. And so here's an illustration of that. Let's say the word is racism. And the definition's a belief that some races are by nature superior to others. Some details, Hitler encouraged racism against the Jews, and so he would be more popular among the German Aryans. In this case, the picture was imported, and the sign says, "Don't buy from Jews." It's illustrating the Nazi racism. Knowledge connection at the racetrack, the blue car said to the yellow car, "I'm greater than you because blue is better and yellow is bad." Okay, so that's the student's knowledge connection. It's a little bit strange, but it is a knowledge connection from the student. Let's go back to this definition for a second and analyze it. It looks pretty good on the most part. It's a belief that races are by nature superior. The only thing that I'm particularly bothered by is the term German Aryans. If students know what Aryans are, this definition works. But if they not, what's happened is I've defined the term using other terms that also need defining, and that's something that we want to watch out for and avoid. So there's an illustration there. when that problem occurs. Now let's look at another one. These are called word castles. The way these work is set up similarly, but it's a few other dimensions to it. So you have a new word. What's the definition? Just in details. What's a knowledge connection? What's it remind you of? What's a picture? And then over here, what would be a synonym, or another word that means the same thing? An antonym, what would be the opposite? And if there is one, a homonym, and then construct a sentence using the term. So you can see all these different prompts are cueing the student to think about the new term on different ways and different levels and so forth. Here's an example of how that can look. In this case, the new word is Creek Nation. The students imported pictures here to illustrate that. Definition, it's a nation of Indians living in Alabama and Georgia. A knowledge connection, an old girlfriend named Kim Weatherford was a creek. Synonym, Ochese, which is another word for the Creeks. The antonym, and the opposite, would have been the white settlers. Homonym, it's a word that sounds the same but means something different, of course. Creek, as in a little river. Sentence, most Creek Indians were forced to move to the Oklahoma Territory by President Jackson. The route was called the Trail of Tears because so many died along the way. And so you can get a sense of how we've used that term and across these different dimensions and so forth. Now, again, I'm going to be kind of going through somewhat quickly through these various samples. So if you want, you can always pause the video if you want to study what teachers or students have noted on these visuals. All the samples are also in your handout, and they're also all on the Make Sense software. So you'll have a chance to go back and look at these more carefully at your leisure. Another one that we'll take a quick look at are called semantic tables. And so if you click on that, this page opens up. Now, some of these are really basic stuff designed for little kids because this whole set of resources is really K-12. However, as we get into more of the web-like things in more detail, they're going to be more appropriate for middle school. And so one I want to point out here is called a semantic table. And so we'll take a look at how those work. All right. So you have your topic or term. And so this term is a member of this group or a type or a part of this bigger thing. And so you choose between the two because all terms are going to be part of something bigger. Okay. Key things to remember about the topic. And so those are listed here. And so each of the various distinctive features of the definition might go there. Why is this topic important? And then draw a picture about the topic. And then is like. So is like is like a simile or a metaphor. And so an example of that is, let's say we're studying about the Plains Indians. It's a member of this group, Native Americans. Key things to remember, they were nomadic, they moved a lot, they lived in teepees, they were hunter-gatherers, and they followed buffalo migration. Now notice that here we used a term that students may not know what it means, nomadic, but we also defined it right there, so that's not too much of a problem. Last group of Native Americans that the United States attacked is one of the reasons why we remember them. Draw a picture, in this case the picture of the teepees on the plains. And is like, so the Plains Indians were like people who live in RVs. They're always traveling and never stay in one place for long. This is another one that setup looks very similar but slightly different. This part is the same. It's a member of this group or is a part of various features of it. And over here it's different in that we're going to look at what would be an example of this and what would be a non-example, or don't confuse it with, is like in terms of a metaphor, simile, what would be a knowledge connection, draw a picture. And so this one is the Southwest Indian tribes are also a member of this group, Native Americans. Features, they live in a very dry climate, few animals, so they farm, they live in adobe houses. And so an example would be the Anasazi, the Hopi, the Pueblo, etc. Non-example would be the Plains Indians, like the Sioux and the Comanche, and is like farmers who lived in brick apartments. Draw a picture. So the adobe houses. Knowledge connection reminds me of the picture of Native American homes built on the sides of cliffs, Mesa Verde. This one's actually a comparison of two terms. And so here we're comparing a kiva with a powwow. when we look at speaking of comparisons, there are several tools you can use here. One is your simple VIN, so we might do things like compare rights with privileges and duties with responsibilities, citizen with non-citizen, and so forth. So these are just straight VINs. Likewise, we can have comparisons with connections. So in this case, it's like a VIN, but there's another dimension to it. So for an example, man's impact on the atmosphere, comparing that with man's impact on the biosphere, and lithosphere versus hydrosphere, and so forth. Now, the other thing that's new about this is the VIN itself is divided in half. So the top half is what's the information or the meaning of that, and then the bottom half are what are personal connections, what's it make you think of, and so forth. And so we've taken that Venn diagram and sort of broken it into two dimensions, what the similarities and differences in what they mean, and similarities and differences in terms of what connections do you make between those two terms. Another one that you can click on are word connections. And again, there are going to be a number here that are really designed more for younger kids and so forth, but there are a couple that you might be interested in for middle school. One are word relationships. And so what we're doing here is we're taking two terms and what both of those words relate to. What's a topic that they're both related to? And then what's the explanation of the relationship? How are these two related to this third topic? So for an example, Isaac and Hagar were both children of Abraham, and here's how the explanation of the relationship. Another one is called personal connections. Pretty simple, but basically the way it works is you have all of these terms are related to this topic. And so you have the new word, what's its definition? Remember, this needs to be in kid-friendly language. And then over here, what's a personal connection? What's it make you think of? So here's an example of that. Succession. It's basically the southern states declaring independence from the U.S. And personal connection, my parents arguing over child custody and property during their divorce. Well, that's succession, all right. Dred Scott decision. Supreme Court decision angered the North, and that led to war. Police treat rich kids better than they treat poor kids. And so when a student makes a connection like that, I'd say, okay, well, that may be true, but how is that connected to Dred Scott? And so what I actually have students do is not only note what the connection is, but they also have to explain it. So anytime they're explaining it, that's linking them back to what this really means, and at the same time making that connection. So this is a fairly simple tool, but it can be really powerful. Best guess is another one that you might want to use. What we do here is we'll list the various new terms, and then what we have students do is to break into pairs or small groups and discuss what they think that term means, and then note what their best guess is. And this is before we've taught the meaning of the term. And so they're basically interviewing each other to try to get a sense of what they think the term means, and then noting what their best guess is. Then later we'll actually teach the meaning of the term in the context of the history or social studies lesson, and then at the end of the lesson we'll have students actually note what the correct definition is. Sometimes they were spot on with best guess and got the correct definition. Sometimes it needed a little tweaking, and sometimes they're really off. So let's say the topic is government systems, and these are various terms that we're teaching, and so students interview each other for their best to formulate a best guess, and then they'll note the definition later after I've taught what each means. Real-world connections. What we're going to do here, we're going to save this for the really important major terms. And the way this works is we're going to take a concept, like a major concept such as civil disobedience, and what students do is they're going to go through the steps of REAL. Okay, so the R step of REAL stands for reveal the key features. So we're going to take civil disobedience and note what's the gist of what that means. And then under that, what are the essential features? And so this is like main idea and details. Then what we're going to do is we're going to start thinking about this term from different perspectives. And so the E step is evaluate its value to our world. And so we're going to be thinking about civil disobedience and determining why this idea should be part of today's world and or should not be part of today's world. In other words, is civil disobedience a good thing or not so great, and why? And so they select one or the other or both, but then they have to tell me why they made the selection under the reasoning section. Then what we're going to do is the A step is analyze reactions. In other words, what are some ways people cause this to occur more? So what do we do that causes people to do more civil disobedience, and or ways people prevent this topic from happening? What do people do to prevent civil disobedience from happening? And so you select one or the other or both, but tell me why under here. And then finally at the bottom, list background knowledge or experiences related to this topic. So we've been looking at a variety of vocabulary smart visuals, and we've been just doing a little sampling of those. There are a lot more here than we actually really addressed in this presentation. So what I would encourage you to do is just to take some time and just kind of explore, click on various sample vocabulary smart visuals and check them out. There may be some that be really useful to you, and there'll be some that won't, obviously. But in the next video, what we're going to look at are various applications from the Make Sense strategies specifically designed to support project-based learning in the middle school.